because this is an 80 mile per gallon car that General Motors made in 2000. And it's a real 80 mile per gallon, average 80 mile per gallon, not what you see on an EPA sticker at a car lot. It actually got up to 90 miles per gallon, a 5-seat sedan, but instead of putting this car and other efficient vehicles on the market, GM chose to put Hummers and SUVs on the market. So it's very critical that we protect the Arctic Refuge, because it's not just the Arctic. What happens to the Arctic directly affects the rest of the planet. The scientists liken the Arctic to the air conditioning unit of the planet, or at least that's what it used to be, because when the sunlight hit that ice that used to remain year-round through almost all of the Arctic Ocean, even in September, the majority of the ocean used to have ice. It would reflect that sunlight back to space, creating a cooling source for our planet. And oceanic currents take that cold Arctic water and bring it down to the tropics in the equator. But what's happening, the burning of fossil fuels, the destruction of forests, and also industrial agriculture is greatly increasing the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, by far the majority coming from the burning of fossil fuels. We've actually changed the chemistry of our atmosphere. From historically, we haven't been above 280 parts per million. We're now at 385 parts per million, increasing at 2.6 parts per million per year. James Hansen said we really need to get below 350 parts per million because we are triggering runaway greenhouse effect mechanisms, positive feedback mechanisms that are kicking in, that are accelerating the warmth. We're in a very dangerous territory that I show in the second edition of my Arctic Melting book coming out in September. And it's not just a slight increase in temperature, it's horrific impacts that are threatened. The actual greenhouse effect is pretty simple science. It's like adding panes of glass to a greenhouse, or the reason your car gets hot and if you leave it in the sun. But how it affects the climate is very complex. And it's hitting the Arctic much greater, in large part because much of Alaska hinged just below 32 degrees. And as it's gone just above that tipping point of that freezing mark, it has caused drastic changes of the albedo effect. And as we lose the ice, is much more open water. This open water is absorbing more sun energy, creating a much accelerating warmth. But this is what is the most shocking. It's what happened last summer, and it's projected to be even worse this summer. So look at the difference here. This is just 2 years. It's incredible. Now you can see how the walrus were unable to reach the pack ice last summer, and all this area, instead of reflecting sunlight, was absorbing sunlight. In portions, it was 14 degrees Celsius above average. And it's very shocking what this means for not only the Arctic, but for our entire planet. It means we're clearly in abrupt climate change. And the coastal communities of Alaska are crumbling into the sea. These communities have been there for thousands of years, and the banks were once very stable. They were buffered by big chunks of ice. There was very little open water, what scientists call a fetch area, because there was ice. Historically, a 3-foot wave was large in the Arctic Ocean because it needs open water to build up the waves. Now the ice has melted that once buffered the shoreline. There's hundreds of miles of open water building up 25-foot waves, pounding the shoreline. This is the village of Shishmarif. Here, where this photo was taken in 2004, there was 150 yards of shoreline just 15 years prior. And this is Kivalina. And when this photo was taken in 2004, there was about 120 yards of shoreline 15 years prior. Since this photo was taken, this home has collapsed into the sea. But an exciting turn of event is this village has filed suit against the biggest coal, oil, and electric companies in the U.S., demanding that they pay for the damage of climate change to this village, demanding that they pay the hundreds of millions of dollars needed to relocate the village, as well as other damages. This is a first of what is going to be an avalanche of lawsuits to hold those accountable for the damage and it could make things change a lot faster to solar and wind and efficiency, as these big companies are going to feel a strong pressure to make changes themselves. And California has filed suit against the auto industry, demanding they pay for the damage of climate change in California. All throughout the Arctic, the land is collapsing into the sea. And this is a report that got woefully little media attention. This is our U.S. Pentagon that found that climate change vastly eclipses the threat of terrorism. And what they warn is exactly what is happening. This is back in 2004. They warned that New Orleans would go underwater, which it did the following year. And they warned that climate change isn't a gradual thing. It's more like the tipping of a canoe. It starts out gradual and then plunges into violent upheaval as the Earth shifts towards its next stable state, and which is a greenhouse Earth, something we haven't seen in 55 million years, and something that it's very uncertain if humans, if our species could survive. It's much worse than we thought a few years ago. And they warned of wars this century based on survival. And one of the impacts they warn about is oceanic currents. The North Atlantic oceanic current is slowing down. This current is formed by the saltier tropical waters. It gets up to the Arctic. As that saltier water cools, it sinks, driving these oceanic currents. The melting of fresh water mixes in. It's already slowed down this current 25%. With very cataclysmic impacts. Nothing like the Day After Tomorrow movie, but it could have very cataclysmic impacts of turning tropical rainforests into deserts and other negative impacts. Another big impact in Alaska is millions of acres of forest have died directly because of climate change. There used to be insects that would just take the weak and sick trees because their numbers were kept so low because of the very cold temperatures that used to exist in the winter in Alaska. These very cold temperatures now are much less common and not nearly as cold, so that the insects have increased in such numbers that are killing millions and millions of acres of forests that are now burning. As if it couldn't get even worse, the warming is triggering more warming. Positive feedback loops, the runaway greenhouse effect mechanisms. And the one of them I mentioned, the albedo effect, as we change from 32 to 33 degrees, in addition to being an impact on wildlife, is a huge impact on the amount of sunlight absorbed by our planet. This shows the circumpolar Arctic, the proportion of the year that it's melted, and all of the increase in that proportion is when there's sunlight. And scientists warn that just the ice-free Arctic Ocean could contribute as much warming as all the greenhouse gases emitted thus far by our species. A huge impact, and that's just one of these feedback loops. There are many, many, many of these. Methane hydrates being by far the most severe, but I won't get into that on this presentation. Melting permafrost holds a teraton of carbon, and that's more than all the emissions that we have emitted thus far. And the permafrost is now melting, releasing that carbon, much of it in the form of methane, a horrifically potent greenhouse gas. And there's really no question that we as humans are the cause of the phenomenon referred to as climate change, and we have got to make tremendous changes very fast. We can't wait a decade. We've got to begin making these changes extraordinarily fast.